Hi all and welcome to my latest video, which features a beautiful tumbling river and my first ever attempt at making pine trees. I've been lucky enough over the last couple of years to have been gifted some products to try in my videos, including Diorama Presepe static grass applicator and scenic materials shown in this video, glue by World Scenics and resin supplies from CFS, sprays from Plasticoat, as well as the Hotwire Foam Factory foam cutting tools demonstrated in the making of this piece. I was very happy with how this diorama turned out. I hope you enjoy watching me make it. Let's crack on. I started with two pieces of 20 cm square extruded polystyrene, and onto the top piece I marked the outline of my river. This is the Hotwire Foam Factory's 3D Pro scroll table. It can be used for cutting all sorts of angles and even cylinders, but for this piece I only needed it to cut out the river. I didn't manage to follow the line very precisely, but that's down to me more than anything else. And as the caption says, make sure you use this in a fully ventilated space and wear a suitable mask. Anyway, once I'd cut out the river shape, I pared it down. This was going to be a sloped river, so I needed to create a sloped river bed, and at this point I wasn't quite sure how I was going to achieve this, so I just kind of pared it away until I had it thinner at one end, but as you'll see that's not how it ended up. So now, taking the two parts of the top board with the river section cut out from the middle, I placed these on the bottom board and drew around them so that I would know where the river section should go. Then I scored along these lines just using a pencil. And then using the Hotwire Foam Factory's hand routing tool, I began cutting away the bottom section of the river. Not so much because I wanted a really deep river, but because I wanted really high banks, and the two halves of the top board would form those banks. This of course would render the work I'd done paring down the river section almost pointless. Almost. The flexible blade of this cutting tool allows you to create bespoke shapes, which made cutting this riverbed an absolute breeze. And talking of breezes, I was doing this on a very cold day in March, with all the windows open. Now, because I'd cut out so much of the riverbed, I knew I'd need to cut my river section in two. Luckily I'd cut an even slope all the way down, but I still had to blend this section in with the lower half of the river, which resulted in a rather happy accident. The fact is, I hadn't planned on putting any kind of waterfall in this piece. The river was just kind of gonna be rough water flowing downhill. But this step in the foam kind of made it unavoidable. And in hindsight, this suited the model much better. So now I started gluing all the pieces together. World Scenics gave me some of their basing glue to demonstrate last year, and I've been using it ever since. It's designed for static grass, but I use it for pretty much everything. For me it falls somewhere between tacky glue and standard PVA, and it's very good at creating a strong bond between foam sheets. A foam brush will help you to achieve even coverage. You don't want the layer of glue to be too thick, or it'll just squidge out the sides like you can see at the top of the picture there. And once everything's carefully lined up and completely pressed together, leave everything to dry for a couple of hours at least before thinking about building up the banks further. And for me, building up the banks meant using pieces of scrap foam, I always keep them, and cutting them to shape using a sharp florist's knife. Actually, probably not sharp enough judging by that cut, but neatness on the bank edges isn't going to matter at this stage. Again, let all this dry thoroughly before even thinking about carving it. In fact, it's a good idea to weigh it down with something flat while you wait. So now, with a once again sharpened florist knife, carving the banks becomes quite easy, and it's also quite therapeutic. though do watch your hands. I won't bother talking over this bit as there isn't really much to say. Right, I'm back, and this is what I was left with after quite a bit of carving. The next stage is adding Sculptamold, and I'm afraid to say that I forgot to film myself mixing it. I could have used some old footage, but then it wouldn't have my nice new cutting mat in the background. So I'll just say what I always say, which is mix it to a relatively thick paste, making sure it's not so wet that it plops off your mixing stick when you lift it, but not so dry that it has powdery pockets in the mix. Then, at this stage at least, just spatula it over the entire model. You may need to smooth it out as you go, but it was so damp here when I did this that I was able to cover the entire piece before it dried. And when you do smooth it, just use your finger. If it has dried a bit too much, you can always just wet your finger. And just carry on until you've got a nice undulating base. I hardly ever use rock moulds, preferring instead to create unique rocks out of Sculptamold or milliparts or other putties and materials, or even bark, but in this case I used more Sculptamold. Just shaping it first with a mixing stick and then later on with clay tools or waxworking tools, or even just my finger. I mean, there's certainly a place for rock moulds, especially if you're creating a large rock surface, but I find sculpting rocks by hand to be a very rewarding process. And here again, I'll just let the pictures do the talking for a bit. Oh, hang on, this is where I need to explain that I'm making the rapids or the waterfall section. And you just need to be careful to leave channels for the resin to flow over later to create a realistic looking flow. These sculpting tools really help with the finer details of the rock surface, and they also help you to fill in any gaps. Now I was going to be painting the rocks with washes, and I found that Sculptamold isn't the best surface for applying washes over, as they don't tend to flow very well over the surface, so I diluted some plaster of Paris to a very, very thin consistency and painted this over the entire rock surface, and this also helped to fill in any remaining holes and gaps and to smooth out the consistency of the rock surface. You'll find that Sculptamold sometimes leaves a slightly hairy appearance, little fibres sticking up where you don't want them, and this is because it is a fibrous material. So adding a layer of plaster is a really good solution. The washes I used were mainly Game Wash from Vallejo. These were their flesh, sepia and green colours, and I also used a black wash and a brown wash that I made myself using matte medium, distilled water and acrylic ink. The Vallejo washes are quite strongly pigmented. First I applied the sepia, and I just applied this over about 50% of the rock surface, and then I went in with the flesh wash, covering about 30% of the sepia and some more of the white. And then a few spots of green. To tie everything together, I just went over it all with my much more diluted brown wash, and this also helped to reduce the garishness somewhat. And once everything had dried, I went in with some of the black wash just to accentuate the cracks, nooks and crannies in the rock. After I'd finished with the rocks, I went over the banks with some Vallejo sepia wash and then some of my homemade black wash. The wash tends to run into the riverbed to create a really nice effect, but you might want to brush it about a bit as well. And with the painting finished, it was time to move on to ground texture, and for this I used brown grout held in place using scenic glue, which is matte medium mixed with water in a 1:3 ratio. And the grout just gets sieved over through a stocking. This is one of Luke Town's tricks. Don't know if he picked it up from someone else, but thanks Luke nonetheless. Make sure to brush away any excess. And then, just to be sure that the grout is thoroughly stuck down and goes off like concrete, give it a spray with isopropyl alcohol and then a further spray with scenic glue. Now I always come in for a bit of stick when I try and pronounce Diorama Presepe, but Fabio has been incredibly generous to me over the last year or so and has gifted me several products to try in my videos. Here I'm going to be using his supercharged static grass applicator with the sieve attachment and several bags of his wonderful static grass. So once again I apply some WWS basing glue, this time in random patches over the dried grout. And because it has a relatively long drying time, you can afford to cover bigger patches at a time than you would normally. And then starting with 2mm grass, I just poured some into the sieve, turned the machine on and shook the grass over the glue. You could attach the grounding clip to a pin, but I didn't bother, I just held it against the surface. But whatever you do, don't touch the sieve while it's working, because this thing does give off a hell of a charge and it will give you a jolt. And once you've turned the machine off, discharge the sieve by tapping it with the grounding clip. Anyway, as for the rest of the static grass, these were 4 and 6mm varieties, and I just mixed them together. There was straw colour and green and brown in here. And it's a good idea to break up any little lumps with your fingers, because that just makes the static grass more easy to apply with the sieve, from which I had now removed the fine mesh to cope with the 6mm fibres. And for this layer I'd be using Hobby & Craft Sealer from Plasticoat as a layering spray. They were very kind and sent me some sprays to use in videos, and this was one of them. In a well ventilated room, I just sprayed it in small patches over the 2mm grass and then applied the 6 and 4mm grass over the top of this. And remember to tap off any excess. You can keep this for later as a custom mix. And as you can see, the layering spray and the 6mm and 4mm combo of static grass really does work a treat, and you can apply some more if you wish for a bushier grassy finish. In fact, I went on and applied some 12mm static grass. Now, I've never had a static grass applicator that's been able to cope with this before now, but it's no problem for this machine, even when the power is significantly reduced by the use of the sieve attachment. Give everything a dusting with more of the sealer just to lock it in place. And just look at that. Perfect static grass. So that was the base layer done, and now it was time to move on to the pine trees, and for this I used some balsa wood, which I cut to size just using that very sharp florist's knife. You could use doweling, but I didn't have any, so I used this 8mm board instead, cut to various heights, the tallest of which being about 20 centimeters. And after that it was just a case of whittling them into a trunk shape with a fine point at one end. This balsa wood was actually a bit denser than the usual stuff, so whittling was easier because of this. Basically, it meant I wouldn't accidentally cut deeper than I intended. So there we are, several trunks ready for branches. Many people use wire for these, but I decided to use the twiggy ends of thyme bushes sent to me again by Diorama Presepe. I still can't get that name right. Anyway, after I'd collected a few bits, I poked a hole in the balsa wood using a pointed tool, squeezed out some superglue gel onto an old piece of palette paper, dipped the end of the twig into the glue and then pressed it into the hole. After that it was simply a case of adding more twigs, boring holes and moving on up the trunks. And speaking of boring, this can be quite a boring task. It takes quite a long time to make one tree, let alone 4 or 5 or 10 or however many you want to do. I listen to audiobooks as I work, which is why there's no sound on my videos other than the music and my voice. I find it really helps as I work through tasks like this. Anyway, as you get near the top of the trunk, you're going to want to rest the tip of the trunk against the edge of your table in order to bore the holes into it. If you try to press into it at an angle, you'll end up breaking your trunk. And you can see I've tried to achieve a downward angle with each branch. Really, I should have painted the trunk first, but I didn't. At least not for this particular tree. I could use an airbrush, but I don't really use them very much. I tend to like using brushes more, for the tactile or manual quality of it more than anything else. But that doesn't stop me using airbrush paints. In this case it was Vallejo Model Air Dirt. And you can see here for the next tree I decided it was a much better idea to paint the trunk first. But this was only a base layer anyway, because I went on to apply Vallejo Thick Mud. This is their Russian mud variety, which has a lovely thick textured finish to it and applies very easily as well. The colour and the texture was perfect for the bark on these trees. And really there was no getting around painting this after the branches had been applied, because I needed to paint over the branches as well. So now it was time to apply the foliage, and for this I'd be using Plasticoat's Hobby and Craft spray glue, which they gave me to use in my videos. And it's important not to get this spray on the trunk, or to avoid it if you can. Nevertheless, give the branches a good coating. And then it's back to the static grass applicator, this time using it without the sieve, and with 4mm dark green static grass. Attach the clip to the trunk, and wow, it's so powerful that I didn't even have time to get the camera in focus. I turned the machine on and it took me completely by surprise. But at least I remembered to discharge the plate, and this was what I was left with after that first run with the static grass machine. And after tapping off the excess, it was time for more spray glue, and then another run. After the second application I was fairly happy with the coverage, so I brushed off the excess from the trunk, which was easy because I hadn't got any glue on the trunk. And the final step for the foliage was sealing it all with Hobby and Craft sealer from Plasticoat. I only ended up using the 4 biggest of these trees, but it was good to make the smaller ones as a kind of experiment to see what I could achieve. And after applying a spike to the bottom of each trunk, with a bit of superglue gel and activator, it was time to plant the trees. So I bored a hole in the ground where I wanted the tree, squidged in some more of the basing glue, and then just popped the tree in the hole. Really, I should have bored a hole in the bottom of each trunk to apply the spike, but I didn't. And the glue that squishes out the bore hole comes into contact with the bottom of the trunk, securing the tree in place anyway. There are a few things I'd do differently next time. The shapes of these trees are actually more like fir trees than pine trees with needles, but overall I was very happy with how they turned out. And of course, no pine tree scene would be complete without dead pine needles on the ground. And for this I used some brown static grass, which I pressed into place around the base of each tree. Gave it a spray with isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension, and then saturated it with scenic glue. I used CFS water clear epoxy resin even before they gave me some resin supplies to use in my videos. This is actually some resin I bought from them a couple of years ago, so it's lasted me a nice long time. It's good quality, it's fairly thick, so it cures relatively quickly, and they're only just down the road from me, so it makes sense. It gets mixed in 2 equal parts by volume, so it's very easy to measure. And remember, don't just copy me, do follow the safety instructions on the packaging. And tinting it couldn't be easier. You can use resin pigments, you can use acrylic paint, but I'm using glass paint here, which retains the transparency of the resin much better than acrylic. However, a little goes a long way, so only a few drops will do. I added about twice as much blue as I did brown. And I mixed it into part A, that's the resin part, before adding this into the hardener part, part B. This isn't really necessary, but it's a habit I've got into recently when I've been using resins that go off a little bit quicker. Either way, stir it until it's streak free. Then it's just a case of pouring the resin onto the riverbed. And in case you missed me making the dam earlier on, this is just masking tape sealed around the edges with some white glue. Be careful when pouring the resin over the waterfall that you don't cover all of the rocks. And because the river is on a slope and you don't want it pouring all down into the bottom section, you need to prop it up. Removing the bubbles from the surface of the resin is as easy as giving it a quick spray with some isopropyl alcohol. And I did notice that my dam was bulging a bit, so I propped it up against a box. And then once the resin has cured, for this brand that only takes about 6 to 8 hours, it's time to remove the masking tape, and this comes away very easily. But it does leave a little lip of resin, which can be easily removed with a sharp knife. Now you may have seen me using Mod Podge gloss to create ripples in the past. This time I thought I'd use a different product, which is intended for the same use, being gloss decoupage glue, but in this case being made by Deco-Mache. Again, I apply it in a relatively thick layer and then blow it around using a straw, and then I draw some ripple lines into it as well using a brush and a toothpick, or actually this is a whittled piece of balsa. I noticed that this particular product creates much softer ripples than Mod Podge gloss. It really depends what you're after. I was very happy with how it turned out in the end, except it did leave a little bit of white streaking, but that was okay because I'd been making some white water anyway with Vallejo Model Air White. And I did this very carefully using a very fine brush. The final stage of putting the scenery together on this model was using some bushes and some plants from Diorama Presepe. Did I get that right? I just tend to feel my way through this process, putting things down where I think they look good before gluing them, and sometimes kind of stitching them into the static grass using a pointed tool. I used a variety of different bushes, some flowering, some not. and I also broke up some of their bigger pieces of stabilised plant material to create smaller bushes and grassy tufts. One thing I like to do is to remove individual flower heads off a larger stem and then use these to create flower patches around the scene. And once that was done, so was the scenery. You can see a bit of white there at the base of that tree, but I covered that up with a bit of foliage later. You can see I managed to create a really naturalistic look, and all that was left was to finish off the sides, to fill in the gaps using some milliput because I'd run out of filler, and then to paint them with black gesso. And that was that. I was very happy with how this scene turned out. I really hope you enjoyed watching me bringing it to life. If you're interested in written tutorials from me, you might like to support me on Patreon, where I offer monthly tutorials on projects not seen on my YouTube channel. Each tutorial features on average over 40 pages of photographs with in-depth written instructions. I'm incredibly grateful to my Patreon supporters and everyone who watches and likes my videos and subscribes to my channel. Thank you very much. So until next time, take care everyone. Cheerio.